Will you join me in prayer? O God of love and mercy, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts and the actions of our lives be deeply rooted in your mercy and in your grace. For you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. There's a small rural town in New Brunswick beside a lake. It's called Lake George. And in the early part of the 20th century, it was a fairly poor part of Canada. People worked really hard and tried to kind of eke out an existence, and it was a logging area, and there was some farming, and of course people went hunting and kind of made a life for themselves, but it wasn't all that easy. Fortunately, there were lots of logs, and so people had a regular cycle in their life of going logging and making a little money that way. And in Lake George, there were these two families that really didn't get along for a whole variety of reasons. And when I say they didn't get along, it was almost like a Romeo and Juliet families didn't get along. There was no tolerance for any association in either of the families with the other family. There was some difference in economic well-being and so on that also created some prejudice and it was just a whole cluster of things. It's the kind of things kids don't play with those kids. That kind of a not getting along. As it happened, a son from one family whose name was Guy, and the daughter from another family, you know where this is going, right? Fell in love with each other. Her name was Roxy. And they knew that if this was to get out, there would be hell to pay in their families. And so they didn't let it get out. They kept it quiet. Well, you see, Guy's family ran a logging operation, and so every winter, the whole family would, just after the freeze, they would head out to a logging camp, and they all were involved all winter in this logging camp that was quite a ways from Lake George, and so they would stay out there. The mom was the camp cook, and everybody was involved in the logging operation. And so Guy went out with his family for the whole winter. This created a kind of a forced separation between Guy and Roxy. Now it was during that separation, shortly after they went off for the winter, that Roxy discovered that she was pregnant. Now, this is the first half of the 20th century. This is not today. And so, in rural New Brunswick, at that time, it was a devastating situation. There's huge family shame that surrounded her circumstances. And so she wrote a letter to her beloved, telling him the situation, and then she waited to hear back from him. Unfortunately, when the mail arrived at the camp cook, Guy's mother, got the letter, opened it up, read it, and never passed it on to Guy. Guy remained unaware of he and Roxy's predicament, had no opportunity to respond. When she had heard nothing from Guy for weeks, 18-year-old Roxy assumed, understandably, that she'd been abandoned by Guy. She was stricken with shame and stuck in her situation. She told her family, and they went ballistic, as you can imagine. furious at Guy for not taking responsibility for his actions. They decided to hide her away for the duration of the pregnancy. This is not an uncommon story at this time in this place. Roxy was ashamed, she was humiliated, she was terribly distressed, and when she finally went into labor, she didn't tell anybody. She went up to her room, she locked the door, and she struggled through on her own until she could struggle through on her own no more. But unfortunately, by the time her family discovered that she was in labor and was in distress, it was too late. She was able to deliver her son, but she died in the process. Her family was devastated, and that incredible pain evolved into anger, and that anger grew into bitterness. And after Roxy was buried in the Lake George United Church cemetery, just behind Lake George United Church, the family erected a gravestone. And there it is today. And on the gravestone, they inscribed in stone, "In this cold grave I lie, I was too young to die. Young friends, I was not to blame. To destroy my life, it was his aim. Here is my deceiver's name, Guy McMurray. You know that God is just and true, and will give this bold wretch his due." When spring returned to Lake George, so did Guy, utterly unaware of what had happened throughout the winter. And of course, utterly heartbroken at the loss of his beloved. The family of his son would not let him see him. The rift that had separated these two families, well, it had solidified into stone. And there was such a gulf of bitterness and anger and shame that it appeared impossible to broach. So bitter was the shame of Roxy's family that finally they packed up and they left Lake George, never to return, taking the little child with them, leaving only this message carved in stone over the grave of their daughter, and leaving, of course, the young man named in the curse on the headstone left to try and create a life for himself under the huge shadow of this curse. What an amazing tangle, eh? I'm one who actually enjoys going to cemeteries and looking at the gravestones and seeing the families configured and imagining the backstory, because you only see little bits and pieces. When we were in Likely with a bunch of guys last spring, there's a cemetery there at Cornell Flats. Fascinating. Just a couple of words tells a huge story. Well, that one tells a huge story if you know some of the backstory. An incredible tangle. And we get ourselves into tangles as human beings, don't we? We do. And as communities, we seem to get ourselves in tangles with remarkably predictable regularity. So it's no surprise that forgiveness and reconciliation was on the front burner for the disciples in conversation with Jesus. And I can tell you that it's on the front burner for probably most of the people who call me up and say, "Can we have a talk?" It is a huge human struggle. And so Peter comes to Jesus with that struggle. How many times must I forgive? As many as 7 times? And think about that question for a second. What is he really asking? How far should I go? Or is he asking, when can I stop forgiving? When can I put an end to mercy and resort to retaliation, which I think would feel really good? When can I finally unleash my wrath, please? When can I give over to my anger? And Jesus basically says, forgiveness doesn't work like that. It's not something we mete out in measures, but it is something that, a work that we are always in. And why? Well, because when push comes to shove, we are at times in need of mercy and at times called upon to offer mercy. And because if we let revenge have its way, we will fall prey to the worst of human nature. As Gandhi put it, an eye for an eye, and the whole world goes blind. But forgiveness is hard. Living from a place of mercy when people hurt and betray, or when cycles of entrenched brokenness roll down from generation to generation. It's complicated and difficult. Look at the truth and reconciliation process. Healing is difficult, especially if the truth has not had its day. Even venturing into this topic is kind of dangerous because I know that probably every single one of us has some circumstance that we're carrying around inside of us. And like every tangle, there are circumstances that you need to account for. So forgiveness almost defies generalization. It's something we need to live in real time. But there are a couple of things I would like to say about it. And first and foremost, and if you walk away with anything from this, walk away with this. For me, forgiveness and healing are pretty much the same thing. What we can say about forgiveness, we can also say about healing. What we say about healing, we can also say about forgiveness. So like healing, forgiveness is a process. It doesn't just happen because we will it to happen. I'm going to force myself to forgive this person. That's not really the way it works. It evolves. It takes practice. It is something that we work at day by day by day. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Gee, I thought I was over that, and here it is right in front of me again. Okay, I'll deal with it again. It takes practice. It's a process. Like healing, forgiveness is something that we can't rush or demand. We need time to heal, time to let hurt go, and then we find that we have somehow picked it up again, so we need more time, and put it down again, and over time, it holds less sway in our heart and mind, the key being over time. You've heard the phrase, time heals all ills. I don't believe it. Time helps, but there's a whole lot more to it than that. Like healing, sometimes it is incomplete. It leaves scars. But you know, even the scars, by the grace of God, sometimes can be signs of a past that no longer holds us captive. They are scars removed of their bitterness, and they become almost trophies of hard-won healing. Like healing, it is not about forgetting. You've also heard the phrase, forgive and forget. I don't believe that one either. I don't think that it is either realistic or helpful. Remembering is actually an important part of forgiveness and healing. Remembering is actually critical. But we can remember with bitterness, or we can remember with wisdom. Those are two very different ways of remembering. Forgiveness is about moving from remembering with bitterness to remembering with wisdom and the strength that comes from that hard-won wisdom. And that is what is at stake in forgiveness, reconciliation, and healing. It is about moving forward, moving from one place to the next in life. It's about being set free from the bitterness of the hurt. It is about our ability to move forward, to not be stuck in a logjam of past events so that they dictate our future, but instead to be free from that logjam such that we can step into a future of our and God's making with mercy at the center. Now, I know that it's difficult, and I know that it's complicated, and I know that in all likelihood you're sitting there right now with a situation that in some way seems to defy the process, seems to be utterly resistant to the process, or seems at least to be stubbornly hanging on. I know that because I got a few of those myself. And so I put that doubt, is healing really possible here, alongside my equally strong, or perhaps hopefully stronger, conviction that by God's grace, even the deepest and most entangled situations can be released of their power over us. All things are possible. And I hang on to that. Guy, the young man who lost his love and lost access to his child, continued to live in Lake George all his life. And the grave marker bearing his name continued to cast its shadow. And the little child grew up in Roxy's family, hearing the bitter story of the death of his mother after that callous father abandoned her. The child grew into an adult and knew of the grave marker and the curse that was marked in it. And eventually, amazingly, he himself could not live peacefully knowing that that marker was there casting its shadow. He returned to the place of his birth, and he returned with a hammer and a chisel. And by hand, he chiseled out the name of his father from the gravestone of his mother. Carved out the shadow that was cast on his father. Did his best to empty that curse of its power over a father that he had never met, and over the families that were represented there. And though I think he never did meet his father, he did send him Father's Day cards every year. You see, he decided that he was going to try and try and try. 7 times? I don't know. 77 times? I don't know how many times. But he decided he was going to try. I'll be damned if the legacy of bitterness and hate that caused so much pain in my family will be my legacy. I'm going to try. The curse and its power stops with me. Tenacious? Yeah. One day at a time? Yeah. Possible? Yeah. Thanks be to God. Amen.